The cult of victory, which was believed to have had prehistoric origins, can be said more generally to be the secret spirit of the greatness of Rome, and of Rome's faith in its prophetic destiny. The Romans were obsessed with victory. They believed they were chosen by the gods, that they were superior to other men, and that they were destined for greatness. Julius Evola's Metaphysics of War focuses on the Roman cult of victory and its deep connection with their faith. To the Roman, war possessed an almost entirely spiritual element which gave metaphysical meaning to all the material actions they engaged in. Sallust described the original Romans as the most religious of mortals, and Cicero said that ancient Roman civilization exceeded every other people or nation in its sense of the sacred. As against the prejudice of a certain historiography which persists in assessing ancient Rome from a solely legal and political point of view, what should be brought out is the fundamentally spiritual and sacred content of ancient Romanity, which should really be considered the most important element, because it is easy to show that the political, legal, and ethical forms of Rome, in the last analysis, had as their common basis and origin precisely a special religious vision, a special type of relationship between man and the supersensory world. The Roman, like ancient and traditional men in general, believed in a meeting and mutual interpretation of divine and human forces. This led him to develop a special sense of history and time, to which we have drawn attention in another of our articles here. Speaking about a book by Franz Altheim, the ancient Roman felt that the manifestation of the divine was to be found in time, in history, in everything which is carried out through human action, rather than in the space of pure contemplation, detached from the world, or in the motionless, silent symbols of a hypercosmia or superworld. He thus lived in his history, from his very origins onwards, more or less in terms of sacred, or at the very least, prophetic history. In his Life of Romulus, Plutarch says in so many words, Rome could not have acquired so much power if one way or another it had not a divine origin, such as to show to the eyes of men something great and inexplicable. I often talk about what I call radical aesthetics. It's sort of my way of explaining metaphysics. Essentially, it's the idea that all metaphysics begin as the material, and through transcendence becomes metaphysical and spiritual. It's like before the artist turns a bunch of colors into a beautiful painting. Each color on its own is nothing more than a sort of insignificant material substance. But the artist, as an architect of metaphysics, facilitates the transcendence of these colors by turning them into a painting that becomes greater than the sum of its parts. To be an architect of metaphysics, one must bend nature into a higher metaphysical form. The Roman conception of metaphysics is no different. They believed transcendence was rooted in human action. Heroism and artistry were the tools of transcendence in which the Roman could enter the realm of the gods and access that super-spiritual world of metaphysics. Hence, the typically Roman conception of an invisible and mystical counterpart to everything visible and tangible which transpires in the human world. This is why rites accompanied every explanation of Roman life, whether individual, collective, or political. Hence, also, the particular conception that the Roman had of fate. Fate for him was not a blind power, as it was for the late ancient Greece, but the divine order of the world as development, to be interpreted and understood as means to an adequate science, so that the directions in which human action would be effective could be foretold. Those along with this action could attract and actualize forces from above, with a view not only to success, but also to a sort of transfiguration and higher justification. Since this set of ideas applied to the whole of reality, it reaffirmed itself also for ancient Rome in the field of warlike enterprises, of battle, heroism, and victory. This fact allows us to see the error of those who consider the ancient Romans essentially as a race of semi-barbarians who prevailed only through brutal force of arms, borrowing from other peoples, such as the Etruscans, Greeks, and Syrians, the elements which served them in lieu of a true culture. Rather, it is true that ancient Romanity had a particular mystical conception of war and of victory, whose importance has oddly escaped the specialists in the study of Romanity, who have limited themselves to pointing out the many and well-documented traditions in question in a distracted and inconsequential manner. The Romans viewed themselves as a people destined for greatness. To the Roman, fate could be altered by man through effort and heroism. Victory in war was one such way to will themselves towards a higher destiny. To prevail and triumph in battle was to honor and prove themselves to the gods as superior beings, thus elevating themselves to a higher existence and ascend closer to metaphysical realms of the superworld beyond the material. It was the essentially Roman opinion that, to be won materially, a war needed to be won, or at least favored, mystically. After the Battle of Trasimene, Fabius says to the soldiers, "Your fault is to have neglected the sacrifices, and to have failed to heed the warnings of the oracles, rather than to have lacked courage or ability." No Roman war began without sacrifices, and a special college of priests, the Officiales, was in charge of the rituals related to war, which was considered a just war, only after these had been performed. As was pointed out by Du Coulange, the root of the military art of the Romans consisted originally in not being forced to fight when the gods were against it, that is, when by means of fatal signs the agreement of forces from above with human forces was perceived to be absent. Thus, the focus of the enterprise of war fell on a more than merely human plane, and both the sacrifice and the heroism of the combatant were considered to be more than merely human. The Roman conception of victory is particularly important. In this conception, every victory had a mystical side in the most subjective sense of the term. In the victor, the chief, the imperator, applauded on the battlefield, was sense the momentary manifestation of a divine force, which transfigured and transhumanized him. The military victory ritual itself, in which the imperator, in the original sense, not of emperor, but a victorious chief, was lifted on a special shield, is not devoid of symbolism, and can be inferred from Aeneas. The shield, previously sanctified in the Capitoline Temple of Jupiter, signifies here the celestial sphere, beyond which victory raises the man who has won. Another example of radical aesthetics is the practice of ritual sacrifice. The sacrifice of animals to attract the favor of the gods and deliver the Romans victory in war begins as a material action. Through their psychological belief that the sacrifice will garner the gods' support, the sacrifice, through the Romans' faith in its effects, transcends into a metaphysical or spiritual action. The material transcends into the superworld, and the result is a Roman legionary who believes his victory is guaranteed. The psychological effect of the sacrifice is a Roman army that will be braver and fight harder, believing they are destined for victory by will of the gods. Revealing and unambiguous confirmations of this ancient Roman conception are provided by the nature of the liturgy and the pomp of the triumph. We speak of liturgy since this ceremony, with which every winner was honored, had in Rome a character much more religious than military. The victorious leader appeared here as a sort of manifestation or visible incarnation of the Olympian god, all the signs and the attributes of whom he wore. The quadriga of white horses corresponded to that of the solar god of the bright sky, and the mantle of the triumphant, the purple toga, embroidered with gold stars, reproduced the celestial and stellar mantle of Jupiter. And so did the gold crown and the scepter with which surmounted the Capitoline sanctuary. And the winner dyed his face with minimum as in the cult of the temple of the Olympian god, to which he then went to place solemnly before the statue of Jupiter the triumphal laurels of his victory, intending by this that Jupiter was its true author, and that he himself had gained it, essentially, as a divine force, a force of Jupiter, hence the ritual identification in the ceremony. Let us point out another characteristic element in the Roman conception of victory. It is precisely because it was seen as a more than merely human event that the victory of a chief often assumed for the Romans the features of a numen, an independent divinity, whose mysterious life was made the center of a special system of rituals designed to feed it, enliven it, and confirm its invisible presence among men. The most well-known example is provided by the Victoria Caesaris. Every victory was believed to actualize a new center of forces, separate from the particular individuality of the mortal man who had realized it, or, if we prefer, by the victory the victor had become a force of existing in an almost transcendent order, a force not of the victory achieved in a given moment of history, but, as the Roman expression stated exactly, of a perpetual or perennial victory. The cult of such entities, established by law, was designed to stabilize, so to speak, the presence of this force, so that it added invisibly to those of the race, leading it towards outcomes of fortune, making of each new victory a means for revelation and reinforcement of the energy of the original victory. Thus, in Rome, since the celebration of the dead Caesar and that of his victory were one and the same, and the games, which had ritual meaning, were consecrated to the Victoria Caesaris, he could be considered as a perpetual victor. Once more, we see radical aesthetics through the transcendence of the victorious Roman conqueror. Through his material victory in war, the Roman general transcends towards higher godlike existence. He leads a parade or triumph through the streets of Rome. His face is painted red to imitate Jupiter, the king of all gods. His material victory becomes a metaphysical achievement, for his victory leads him being displayed as akin to a god. In addition, the Romans take this further by immortalizing the victorious conquerors, the perpetual victors. Though not explicitly an ascension to godhood, status as a perpetual victor represents becoming a god, having one's name etched in history due to his victories. Victory in war grants the individual transcendence from a merely material to a greater metaphysical existence as one of the higher men of history. The cult of victory, which believed to have prehistoric origins, can be said more generally to be the secret spirit of the greatness of Rome and of Rome's faith in its prophetic destiny. Other considerations could be derived from the Roman notion of mors triumphalis, triumphal death. Here we just want to add something about one special aspect of the heroic dedication connected to the ancient Roman concept of devotio. It expresses what in modern terms could be called a tragic heroism, but linked to a sense of suprasensory forces and a higher and very specific purpose. In ancient Rome, devotio did not mean devotion in the modern sense of the meticulous and over-scrupulous practice of a religious cult. It was, rather, a warlike ritual action in which the sacrifice of oneself was vowed and one's own life was dedicated consciously to lower powers, whose unleashing was to contribute to bring victory, on the one hand, by endowing one with irresistible strength, and on the other hand, by causing panic to the enemy. It was a rite established formally by the Roman state as a supernatural addition to arms in desperate cases, when it was believed that the enemy could hardly be defeated by normal forces. From Livy, we know all the details of this tragic ritual and also the solemn formula of evocation and self-dedication which the one who intended to sacrifice himself for victory had to pronounce, repeating it from the pontifex, clothed in a praetesta, his head veiled, his hand at his chin, and his foot on a javelin. After that, he plunged to his death in the fray, a fatal force, no longer human. There were noble Roman families in which this tragic ritual was almost a tradition. For example, 3 of the stock of the Decii performed it in 340 BC in the war against the rebellious Latins, then again in 295 in the war against the Samnites, and once more in 79 at the Battle of Ascoli, as if this was a family law, as Livy puts it. The Roman cult of victory inspires the ultimate sacrifice, death in battle. Devotio, once more, is the process of radical aesthetics, the material sacrifice of a Roman noble charging into battle like a Viking berserker has the practical function of killing enemies and inspiring one's comrades, who believe the sacrifice will grant them divine support from the gods. Through this sacrifice, however, the individual and the victory of the Roman army transcends into the metaphysical. The sacred sacrifice for victory in battle, the element which Romans utilized to take charge of their fate and destiny, assumes a spiritual and metaphysical implication which propels the Roman to the status of a divine martyr whose existence transcends to a higher plane. Evola sort of compares devotio to the Japanese willingness to sacrifice in battle. He notes similarities in the spirit of the samurai, as well as the 20th century Japanese soldier who flies planes or other operated vehicles into their enemy, giving up their lives in an attempt to grant their side victory, as well as obtain an honorable and glorious death in the eyes of their gods. The Roman cult of victory essentially shows us what man can achieve when he believes in a higher purpose, when he is willing to sacrifice for higher existence. This idea that we as mortals can turn the material into the metaphysical, that through our actions we can transcend and our lives end up taking on more meaning. It's sort of this existentialist outlook on life, this existentialist outlook of through my actions, through my indomitable will, I can turn my material life into something spiritual. Through my sacrifice and my willingness to struggle for something more, I can achieve a higher existence that transcends into that spiritual realm, that I can turn the material to the metaphysical as an architect of metaphysics. Essentially, if life is our canvas, we as the artist can paint that canvas with our blood, sweat, and sacrifice and turn all those individual colors, which are all the material things around us, all of nature, and we can bend that nature into something more, bend it to our will and create something more, create that deeper, higher metaphysical existence. As I've talked about in many of my other videos about consumerism and Nietzsche's last man and the sort of modern creature that we see today around us, we're not satisfied with a merely material existence. We're not satisfied with the comfort of bourgeois modernity. We're not satisfied with our role, our economic role in an economic machine. We don't want to be defined by how we consume and how we contribute to consumption. We want to be defined by something greater, by something deeper, by something which represents a higher purpose. And this is exactly what we see in the Romans. The Romans turned war into something sacred, something beautiful in their eyes, something worth sacrificing for. And if we ourselves don't have something that we are willing to die for in our lives, that we're willing to sacrifice for, then we're missing a special element of what makes us so terribly human. Essentially, what I'm trying to get at is we have to live a life of heroic existentialism. We have to will the material into something greater. We have to take our lives, which on the surface is just a collection of all these material things, and through our will, as I said, we have to will ourselves towards that higher existence. We have to be willing to sacrifice and struggle and do things that are difficult to try to find that deeper meaning that we can create. So that's sort of my message with this, but as always, this is the Warrior Philosopher, building the foundations of the warrior philosophy. We'll see you next time.